GWATA TV gives you a first look at North Central Washington's business news. You'll hear from our local business, tech, and education companies as Jenny discusses hot topics and current events with some of the best innovators and pioneers in North Central Washington.
Hello, North Central Washington. I'm Jenny Rojanasatian, your host for GWATA TV. On today's episode, we're going to dive into some small business best practices by interviewing two different guests at professional service providers in North Central Washington. First, we're going to talk to our friends at Ogden Murphy Wallace to talk about some legal considerations for your small business and tips and advice that you should consider. Then we'll talk to Moss Adams, who will share their advice in terms of an accounting standpoint and things to look for as far as changes in 2019. Stay tuned for a great episode. I'll be right back with my guest. We're on air at GWATA TV, and I'd like to introduce my first guest, Jennifer Sands with Ogden Murphy Wallace. Welcome to GWATA TV.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me. It's exciting.
It's really exciting for me. We were talking off air about this is our first opportunity to work together directly. We've been working at GWATA with Ogden Murphy Wallace for many years. Such a great organization. So it's nice to get to meet another part of the firm.
Yes, and although we haven't met before, I'm very familiar with what Ogden Murphy Wallace is doing with GWATA and with Flywheel. We're excited and proud to be a sponsor of the Flywheel Conference, and so kind of behind the scenes I follow what GWATA is doing and our involvement. It's exciting.
But you personally are very much not behind the scenes, so let's tell a little bit about the work that you do. Jennifer, what is your role at Ogden Murphy Wallace?
Well, I'm a member at Ogden Murphy Wallace. I've been there for about 10 years, and I'm a member in their business department. Ogden Murphy Wallace, we have about 11 attorneys in Wenatchee and 49 in our Seattle office. Okay. So that's quite a bench to provide services to small, medium, and large businesses. So I'm part of that team.
And that's a huge asset, I think, for North Central Washington. That Ogden obviously has a really strong presence here, but you have that connection to Seattle, and you really support business across Washington State, and I'm sure even further than that. But but you have the resources to tap into the big city firm while being a part of our community.
Exactly, and that local kind of love of the region. But the experience out of Seattle, because they've seen more at times, just the volume of transactions and the natures and types. So they're able to step in, help, and that, obviously it's a benefit to them. They love being involved here because it's such a growing and dynamic area. I grew up in Wenatchee. I'm not going to say when, how long ago, but and I've been back for about 10 years. I practiced in California too, and to see Wenatchee, the growth it's undergoing and what it's doing is, and the entire region is very exciting as kind of a hometown.
I agree. We have a great community to live, and the backbone really of the community growth is small business. We have a huge entrepreneurship ecosystem here, which requires a lot of support from professional service providers, right? Right. To keep us entrepreneurs with our T's crossed and our I's dotted.
Right.
So tell us a little bit about how do you serve business owners in your role? What's the type of work that you're involved with?
So, again, we and I serve from the full kind of life cycle of a business, and that would be from deciding what choice of entity, what type of tax selection might be advisable for a business at the outset, through on to the end or transition of a business, whether that's because they're closing, they're selling, they're merging, or they're transitioning to the next generation. I also do estate planning, which has a nice symbiosis at times with small business because often it's family involvement.
It's part of the estate planning process.
Right, and those work together. And so there's kind of the beginning and the end, and then everything in between, kind of what it takes to keep it going, interact with employees, interact with customers, vendors, lease property, buy property, just kind of the bread and butter of what supports that business, what it's doing.
And speaking of kind of interactions with employees, vendors, tell some of your advice around digital communication practices for small businesses and what you've been seeing.
So digital communication practices, which is a huge topic, but I've been seeing with just the how quick business is done with texting, the evolution of how we communicate has also led to the evolution of what those communications can create, and that includes potentially an exchange of texts or emails, or I suppose a tweet and a comment. Might inadvertently, I should say, or without the kind of full intention of the parties, actually create a binding agreement. The parties might just be exchanging, could be purchase prices, where I've seen this as in real estate, actually, in a very hot real estate market where investors or small businesses are seeking multifamily, or maybe they're seeking a lease space with electrical capacity. That was important a couple years ago with data mining.
Mm-hmm.
And they're negotiating a price, but the other party might be negotiating with a couple other people at the same time, but you've got this full email exchange, maybe some texts, and say, done, $600,000, we have a deal. And you think you might have actually entered into a commitment that you can, to buy it. You're thinking, I'm done.
Right.
I've signed it, my auto signature is there, and we have the terms, and we've got an agreement. And that may be the case, and you may have enough there to have an enforceable agreement, although you really maybe thought, or the other party tries to get out because they thought, well, no, I meant subject to, a real agreement that we signed, like that the attorneys drafted. But you might have already entered into that binding commitment. So with how negotiations are so quick now, and so I read a fun fact that there's 6 billion texts are sent in the U.S. daily. So and things are going quickly, and
right.
People might think, well, great, I've got it, and maybe the other party doesn't want it, and maybe they do, but I think it's a function of awareness.
Right.
Just those communications that you might think are informal might actually have consequences beyond that, and that's really if the terms are there and you've kind of acknowledged it with your signature, and it could be an auto signature.
Well, I find that fascinating because when we were building today's program and I was thinking about digital communication between vendors and employees, I think my mind was automatically going to almost this HR route of, which is also
Yes.
big, right? Be careful what you say. But you're absolutely right. Business is done now often really quick from a contract standpoint. And you could be locking yourself in a contractual way with an employee as well.
Right.
If you're making these statements via text without an in-person or a follow-up with an attorney.
Well, and that's a great point as
Right.
well, or even at the potential employee in an offer of compensation or something that really, they might say, hey, you agreed to this, and then you go back and say, oh, I really meant that was the full value of your compensation with benefits or something.
Right.
So it might be helpful if your exchanges are getting to kind of a materiality level to say, I think done deal subject, to final contract, or subject to signed contract
Right.
might be a best practice.
Best back practice to add it.
Yes. Yes.
And then, going into the contract process, what is your advice around looking at your agreements and contracts and things that small businesses should do on a regular basis?
So, as a lawyer, obviously, I'd say you should kind of comb over those on a regular basis and be able to say, no, I don't want to do that. But what concerns me at times are, especially in a new business, where they say, I've just got to have this agreement. It's kind of the for now agreement, I'll call it, because the bank needs it, their insurance company needs it. So they say, yes, we need this really quickly. and then we'll come back and revisit it. So they actually signed something that is governing their relationship, but they didn't really intend it to be long-term, and or it has blanks in it, actually, and those blanks might be, hey, what's the capital contribution, what's the buyout price, or it doesn't have these schedules attached. So there's different levels of contracts you should go back and review, I think, and there's those kind of for now agreements. Oh, we signed this LLC agreement, we signed a buy-sell agreement, and we intended to revisit it because we just signed it to get it done, or they might have pulled it off the internet and done it on their own. And not really, I have clients who say, yeah, I didn't really read that, or I didn't really understand that, or we haven't been doing it that way. And need to keep in mind that if you have a written agreement but you haven't really been doing it that way, you might be modifying that agreement even unintentionally,
Right.
again, by the course you're taking. And then there are agreements that are used, you might use as a form if you're a business where you have liability waivers, form employment agreements, that you should kind of revisit. So those are things that you're pushing out to others and asking them to sign for you. You should revisit those, every couple years, just because the law does change. Form employment agreements can be kind of especially sensitive, and personnel policies, form non-disclosure agreements.
Okay.
Those are things that they should kind of be cultivated or curated on an ongoing basis. People don't want to do that because it might sound fun for me, but it doesn't sound fun for the small business owner. They just want to do
They want to do
their
the business. Yes.
But it's better to know, I feel like.
Right.
If you kind of can't remember what a fundamental agreement says, you should maybe dust it off. Or if you read it and you don't know what it says, or there's a missing term, it's just good. It's kind of good housekeeping, spring cleaning to every once in a while look at those.
Yeah, and come back around.
Right, as between owners, right, you might have or things that you're using customarily in your business day to day.
That makes absolute sense, and some advice that I might take home and apply as well. So Jennifer, thank you for that advice. Where can people find Ogden Murphy Wallace if they wanted to connect with you or someone else at the firm?
So we are at, as I tell people when they say, where's your office? We're literally at the end of 5th Street. We are on the river. You can go no further. So we're at 1 5th Street,
Okay.
Suite 200. We're also obviously at omwlaw.com.
Okay.
And we are kind of out and about, involved in the community as well. So that's where you can find us.
And at the Flywheel Conference.
Yes.
Coming up.
Excited.
So great
Yes.
place to meet. Well, thank you for being on air with me. I really appreciate it. It's time for a commercial break, and when we come back, we'll have our partners from Moss Adams. We're back on GWATA TV, and I have a new guest, Randy Finich with Moss Adams. Welcome to GWATA TV.
Well, thank you, Jenny. I appreciate being here.
Well, we just had a great interview with Ogden Murphy Wallace, a great partner with Moss Adams, and we're talking about small business practices. So before we dive into Moss's advice on small business practices, tell us a little bit about Moss Adams, who you are and what you do in our community.
Sure. So Moss Adams is a national accounting firm. We are, I believe, about 12th in the nation. I say about because that changes. There's lots of mergers going on and that sort of thing, but about 12th. We have a little over 3,000 people, primarily based on the West Coast, based out of Seattle. We have a large central Washington practice centered in Yakima, Wenatchee, and Tri-Cities.
And you head up all of those locations, so you're really all over our state supporting businesses, a lot of agriculture, right?
Correct.
In the region as well. As far as folks looking to find Moss Adams in Wenatchee, where are you guys located?
We are out in Omi Gardens Business Park.
Okay.
It's 123 Omi Gardens Road.
Easy to remember.
Easy to remember, yes. We used to be on 123 Easy Street,
Okay.
which was easier to remember, but
Right.
anyway,
Yeah.
up in the north, good, easy to find.
Yeah, and Moss has been wrapping up a really busy tax season, and I know you've come prepared to kind of share some of the things you've seen and some advice for small business owners. So let's kind of dive right into that.
Okay.
What are incentives, I can't say the word, that small business owners tend to overlook?
Well, there's a couple of tax incentives out there right now, particularly for small business and startup businesses. One of them is R&D credits, And what's nice about this one is you can use it to offset payroll taxes. And the reason that's advantageous is a lot of small businesses that are startups don't pay any income tax. They're not making enough money to pay any income tax. So if you do an R&D credit, it just gets carried forward.
And if you ask any business owner, I think payroll taxes are a pain point.
They are, and so if you can offset them, that's awesome.
Right.
So it's you can offset up to, or you can get up to about a $250,000 credit if you have qualifying R&D expenditures.
Okay.
And what those are as it suggests, expenditures related to experimental type of processes to improve processes, develop a new product through modeling or simulation, that sort of thing. So costs such as W-2 wages, supplies, if you use subcontractors, those kinds of things, up to generally about 10% of those costs you can offset against your payroll taxes if you're a qualifying small business. And to be that, you have to have gross receipts of less than $5 million,
Okay.
and you essentially can't have been in business more than 5 years.
Okay.
So it's specifically designed for new businesses.
So it's an incentive to try to, I guess, accelerate growth, right? Because you're talking about R&D, which is going to help, hopefully, that company get to that next level. Yep. And is the $5 million mark the general qualifier on small business?
Well, it is for this particular one.
Okay. I'm sure there's a whole section in the tax law of what qualifies. Okay.
There is, and I will caution you on R&D credits.
Okay.
The IRS is very sensitive to these.
Okay.
And so if you do it, you want to make sure you have great documentation.
Okay.
And it's best, obviously, if you use a professional that specializes in this to help you out.
That's why you need your CPA.
Exactly.
To come on board.
Exactly.
Behind this.
Mm-hmm.
Now, let's also talk in terms of fraud. I know that you had some advice around fraud that you've been seeing for small businesses.
Yeah, this topic comes up all the time. There's almost kind of this morbid curiosity where business owners want to know, tell me some more stories, what's going on?
Right.
And, you know, they are interesting.
Right.
But the fact is, when you look at the statistics, it's really a matter of when you're going to get hit by fraud, not if.
Okay.
And including cybersecurity, which I think we'll touch on as well. But one thing that is interesting, the American, or the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners comes out with a report every year. And they just came out with one. It's got all the statistics based on a survey that they do. And small business, generally, fraud loss at small businesses is twice as much as it is at large businesses. And what I'm talking about here is misappropriation of assets, so stealing. Okay. Which is typically money, but it could be inventory or other products that your company handles. But the average is about $200,000 for small business loss and about $100,000 for big business. And the way they categorize that is less than or fewer than 100 employees or more than 100 employees.
And is this because the small businesses maybe don't have the same systems in place that a larger corporation has in terms of whether it's employee management or inventory controls that makes them more susceptible to fraud and that exposure?
Oftentimes that's the case.
Okay.
Because you don't have enough people to what they call segregate all the responsibilities so that a person isn't in a position where they can take advantage of a situation. But there are some things that you can do and that you should do as a business owner. First, you want to be involved. You want to pay attention. Lots of times you'll have an entrepreneur that is out there just driving business and letting everyone else take care of that. That can be a big mistake. You've got to pay attention and get in and look at some of the information on a regular basis. And there's different processes that you can set up. So
kind of creating a checks and balances structure. And you're right. I think noting that's really important because entrepreneurs are usually the visionary, sales-oriented, driving their company forward. Maybe not always the best at accounting, I imagine.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. That's what happens. But you want to find somebody that can sort of mind the store for you, but you still have to check on them. Every single time I've had a client that has had a fraud, perpetrated on them, the first thing everyone has said, I trusted that person. It's like, of course you did, because I assume they wouldn't have been working for you if you didn't.
Right.
And I guess the point here is, just like you've heard the adage, hope isn't a strategy, trust isn't an internal control. You should trust all of your people, but you need to have some controls and some checks in there. So some of the things that are key areas to implement to try to help prevent fraud. If you look at that survey, the majority or the largest, the one thing that detects most fraud is our tips. So tips typically from inside the organization.
Interesting.
So that accounts for 40% of the fraud that is detected. Sometimes those tips come from outside, but usually it's another employee basically telling on another one.
Right.
And the best way to facilitate that as a company is to have a fraud hotline. And these are very inexpensive to set up with you can outsource that, set it up, and your employees know it's there. It's totally anonymous. Call in and you get your tip. And the majority of those 40% tips came off of fraud hotlines.
Well, and I think that goes back to your comment of what you just said about trust.
Mm-hmm.
Because, right, you're hopeful, but it's not a good strategy, that the people you've employed want to do what's right for the company. So by creating a fraud hotline, you provide an opportunity to keep that honesty with maybe when they're not comfortable, right? Because
Exactly.
it's uncomfortable to tattle on someone or
absolutely.
to be the person who's blowing the whistle. So it creates a safeguard for those trusted employees who want to take care of the business.
Exactly.
Now, there's other types of attacks that happen on small businesses, but those come from outside the organization as well in terms of cybersecurity. What are some of the things you've seen?
Well, and this is been rampant. It's interesting. As a firm, we have a group that does nothing but cybersecurity consulting. They are easily the busiest people in our firm, constantly being called upon by our clients. In fact, to the point where we actually merged in a firm last November that does nothing but this. And so we have 30 full-time people, over 30 full-time people, doing nothing but cybersecurity analysis and consulting and helping companies put the kinds of safeguards they need in there. But you know, the simplest one, and this happens all the time, is the phishing emails. I get those constantly, and we have very tight firewalls, but they make it through, and thankfully I haven't clicked on one yet, because I'll tell you what, talk about the walk of shame when you when you have to go tell your IT person, I think I clicked on this.
The wrong one. Right.
So, but anyway, so you get those, and you get those all the time. One of the things that a company should do is make sure their employees are trained to recognize those, because they are really easy to fall for. Never click on anything that you don't know where it came from, or any attachment that you don't know where it came from. So that's a common one. The other ones that you'll see, and there's been a few instances of this around, where ransomware gets installed. And what ransomware is, it allows someone to invade your system, and they won't, free it up unless you pay a ransom. And it basically freezes your entire system, and they've got you. And I know there's been more than a few local companies that have been subjected to that, and it's unfortunate. And
and they literally hold you hostage.
They hold you hostage,
right?
Exactly.
And your privacy and your data and customer information until you pay that. So you're absolutely right. Putting those safeguards in place, training your employees. Something that we do at the GWATA office is when we get a phishing emails, to share it, like not forward it, but to share what it was. So in case someone else gets that same email, that it's fraud and it's not what you want to go down. This is all such great advice for our small businesses. I know that we are going to touch on one thing before we have to head out today, which was what do companies need to keep in mind when considering a transaction? I know you had some advice to share there.
Yes, and this comes up a fair amount, and this is both for startups that are looking for investors and mature businesses that are maybe looking for an exit strategy. But you want to make sure that you've got all of the fundamentals taken care of, and usually that starts with all of the financial record keeping. And as we were talking about before, that's usually the last thing an entrepreneur thinks about,
Right.
but it's the first thing an investor asks for. Well, let me see your financials.
Right.
And the credibility of those numbers really makes a big difference to potential investors. So you'll want to consult with somebody. There's lots of really good providers out there that'll help you establish a good set of books and a good set of procedures. You want to get that taken care of out of the gate and avoid one of the things that is most frustrating, I think, for investors is when there's a lot of personal activity going through the business accounts. Keep it separate as much as you possibly can. And then as a mature company, if you're out there, there's a lot of activity out there with private equity and institutional buyers purchasing local companies. But again, you want to make sure that the best thing to do is to seek the assistance of a consultant that can look at what you've got from a financial standpoint, from a management standpoint, from a strategy standpoint, to make sure you've got everything either in shape or moving in the right direction. And you should be starting that at least a couple of years before you think you're going to have this event.
Well, I love your point about even as a startup, really having solid books, projections, and working with a professional, because with the Flywheel Conference and the competition we saw, some of these companies were still in concept only.
Right.
But investors still want to see what the financials, where their expenses have been and what they're projected.
Exactly.
And they want it to be at the caliber of a CPA produced report, regardless of the fact that the company's not gotten off the ground, right?
Exactly.
This is a critical point in order to get that investment. So on that note, I think we have to let you go for today, but I invite the audience to come meet with you at the Flywheel Conference next week. The Moss Adams team is going to be out in force.
We will be.
A huge sponsor, so thank you so much for that. And for more information, definitely go visit our friends at 123 Omi Gardens. Okay, perfect. Well, thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.
All right. Thanks, Jenny.
Thank you.
Since 1999, GWATA has served as North Central Washington's Tech Alliance. As a 501c3, our mission is to bring people and technology resources together to create a thriving community. Through our work, we aim to inspire, engage, and connect.